All right, I think we're hitting critical capacity at 1.3K, so let's begin. Welcome, delegates. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here today. And more importantly, welcome, Kevin. Thank you for joining us at this conference. The delegates just had the chance to hear from Dr. Tedros Adhanom, the Director General of the World Health Organization, and they're very excited to hear from you. So thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, Zeel. Thanks for having me.
The honor's all mine. So Kevin is someone that needs no introduction, but I'll give it to you anyway. Kevin is the global managing partner of McKinsey and Company. He did his undergrad at the University of Glasgow. I believe he's the only global managing partner that did his undergrad there, from my quick search. And more importantly, Kevin is an alum of Harvard Business School. So for the many hundreds of Harvard undergrads that are in attendance today, I know they'll really appreciate that, especially the sense of normalcy, given how school has been fully virtual for the past year. So thank you, Kevin, again, for joining us, and I'm delighted to kick this off. I wanted to start this off with some quick icebreakers, actually. It's just things that everyone wants to ask the McKinsey Global Managing Partner, but probably never got the chance to. First of all, so you travel quite a bit in a pre-pandemic world. What country would you say was your favorite country to visit, and why?
Oh, that's easy. Scotland, of course. Scotland. I'm Scottish. It's home. It's a wonderful place. It combines the best of the outdoors with great people, and it is home. And it's always good to go home. So that's a very easy one to answer, Zeel.
Okay, that's completely fair. And as a former consultant for most of your career, you travel quite a bit. So I wanted to ask, well, when the choice is yours, what airline do you prefer to fly, just for leisure?
Cathay Pacific. I've always been a loyal Cathay Pacific fan when I was living in Hong Kong. And frankly, after that, I must admit, usually my choice of airline reflects where I need to be and when I need to be. We need to be there. So that drives it more than anything else.
That makes sense. And for the hundreds of Harvard undergrads that are in attendance, a lot of them wanted to know the answer to this. When you were at HBS, what was your favorite study spot on campus?
Oh, Shad, the athletic center. There was no bon pan in Shad, and I would just sit there and do my thing.
Oh, wow.
For whatever reason, that was it. The Baker Library was not a bad place either to just go and spend some time, but I probably spent more time in Shad than I did anywhere else.
Okay, very interesting. I haven't spent time there myself, but that's really good to know. Kevin, you also read quite a bit, and I wanted to ask, since childhood to now, if you had to pick one book in particular that influenced your worldview the most, what would you pick and why?
That's a good question. I would pick Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Adam Smith is known for The Wealth of Nations, the godfather of capitalism, the invisible hand, and the notion of the market. But that was written in 1776, and I view it as his lesser work when he was at a lesser university. He was down south in England. But before that, 17 years before, in 1759, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments when he was the Regius Professor of Moral Philosophy at Glasgow University, which, as you've acknowledged, is indeed the finest university on the planet, with Harvard being somewhere just after that. And when he wrote this work, he essentially wrote about the responsibility of business to society. And I think if you read Theory of Moral Sentiment, it's very relevant to today. And it's a good antidote to the idea that the business of business is business, because Adam Smith wrote a lot about the role of the business person, the way in which they were part of the community, and that the business person cannot prosper if the community does not prosper. And I think that was just as relevant then as it certainly is relevant now.
Yeah, that's an interesting symbiosis. Okay, thank you for the recommendation. I also wanted to ask, if you could have dinner with any person throughout history, who would you pick and why? Because I know as the global managing partner of McKinsey, you get to meet a lot of very interesting people. But if you had to extrapolate that through history.
Well, I'll leave Adam Smith out of it. Winston Churchill, a remarkable leader. I'm British. He led the country through a very difficult time and came from obscurity, and maybe not obscurity, but certainly came from the backbenches and exile from politics in terms of the front line, and had a profound effect on the destiny of the UK. So and his first time as an MP was in Dundee in Scotland, so he had ties to Scotland too. So I'd be fascinated to have a chance to understand how he found the oratory, but also the heart to lead the country through the Second World War. I would love to understand that form of leadership, and also understand the things that were less good about his background. I mean, he was also involved in some of the darker moments of the British Empire. I think it's important to understand how he could retrospectively look at that period too.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Final question for this sort of quick icebreaker. You must have quite a bit of meetings in a typical day. I just wanted to ask, on an average day, what does that total number of meetings look like? And how do you sort of balance that time with family and your two daughters?
Oh gosh. Well, it's very different under COVID because I'm not traveling. So I travel, but very, very minimal travel. Look, I cram in a lot of meetings. That is true, and so I typically, my meetings are quite short, 1 hour if they're external, half hour if they're internal. Breaks in between. I always work out first thing in the morning, so I'm up about 5:30, work out for about 90 minutes. Then, have breakfast with my wife, start the day, and religiously have dinner with her since we're all together. If my daughters are here, although they're both at university in the States, and therefore they've both gone back to. They haven't actually gone back to campus. They've gone back to their respective houses near campus. One of them is on campus, the other one isn't. And when they're with us, of course, we try and spend as much time as possible together. I will say that, one of the things I'm quite proud of is I haven't missed a parents' evening or anything like that in my career. I'm very committed to being there. And my wife works too, so we have to juggle things, but it works out. It works out.
That's very admirable. Thank you. So before we kick off to start talking about your career and McKinsey, I just wanted to make an announcement to the delegates. In the last 20 minutes, we'll have a Q&A session. So you can feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A chat box and upvote the ones that you'd like to see asked the most. And then my team will filter it and send them up to me. All right. So Kevin, there's this very famous story of when you were the president of the student union at Glasgow, at the University of Glasgow. And that's how you sort of first learned about McKinsey and got involved in the pipeline and went down to London. So could you share that with us and sort of how that went?
Sure. So I did not have a career ambition to be a consultant. I have to say that right up front. In fact, I was a law student at Glasgow University. I was studying law in Scotland as an undergraduate degree. And then you do a postgrad to complete your qualifications. But I was in the undergrad part of the law program. And towards the end of my time, I knew I wasn't necessarily all that excited about being a lawyer in Scotland forever, which is what a Scots law degree would do. And one night, I spent a lot of my time as president of the student union. And that basically meant we ran the largest bar in Scotland. In fact, we had five bars all in one building. It's still there to this day. And we also did debating and various other things. But part of the task we had was at the end of every night, you had to kick everybody out because the licensing laws meant at 11 o'clock, we had to shut our doors and people had to go home Monday to Friday. And one night we did that. And I was going around as the board member responsible for making sure the union was secure. And as I was cleaning things out, I saw this brochure, recruiting brochure, and it was for McKinsey. And I read the brochure and I thought it sounded pretty interesting. So I sent my application off and I got a very nice letter back that said, thanks for your application. We've not actually traditionally recruited from the University of Glasgow, but my father is Scottish, love to meet you. And that's essentially how it all happened because they then offered to fly me down to London, which was very nice. I first went on a plane when I was 21. Most of my holidays, my parents were educators, so we would take our holidays in our caravan and drive to various places. So I didn't really fly anywhere. And when I first flew, it was because I was into debating and we were flying to debating competitions. So for me, flying was novel. So got the trip to London, met with the person who had a great conversation, met with a few other people, went back home. And meantime, I'd also applied to the Kennedy School for a Kennedy scholarship to go to the K School. And I was lucky enough to be awarded the Kennedy scholarship. So I called up McKinsey to say, look, I'm going to take the scholarship and go to Harvard. They said, well, you could come to us first. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And they said, why don't we'll send you the offer and see what you think. So they sent me the offer and I showed it to my father and mother. And when they looked at it, they said, son, that's more than we earn together in a year. Why don't you go work for McKinsey first? Because that sounds like a good thing to do. I'm afraid that story of chance finding a brochure, deciding to go to the firm because my parents thought it was the right thing to do, that's actually how I ended up being a consultant. And I guess the rest is history. And I never made it to the K School, which is a source of regret. With hindsight, I would have loved to have done a Kennedy scholarship and gone to the K School.
Well, I'm sure it's also a source of regret for the Kennedy School to have missed you. But as we think about that in hindsight, actually, now, when you were first elected in as a global managing partner, did you sort of shoot a text to the people that you met in London and say, like, did you imagine how this would go or anything like that?
No, it's a short answer. No. I mean, look, first of all, it is a big deal. I'm not going to say that it isn't, but we are a partnership, and therefore the global managing partner is not a CEO. I'm not a CEO in the traditional sense, and therefore you don't celebrate like that. I feel the responsibility that comes from my colleagues voting for me to be the person that represents them, and that's what I felt. I felt a profound sense of responsibility. I'd be lying to you if I didn't sort of every now and again think this is sort of a bit crazy. I grew up in Scotland. Mother's a teacher, father's a university academic, humble in some sense background. And here I am, and every now and again, what the hell am I doing speaking to all these people at Harvard and beyond? I mean, it's absurd. It is. I still pinch myself over that. That's probably more how I feel, and still how I feel. It's an awful long way from Eaglesham Road, Glasgow, which is where I grew up.
Well, you were also born in Canada too, which I thought was great because I'm Canadian.
I was born in Canada. We didn't last very long. I mean, the Canadians. No, we were born in Canada. I was born in Canada because my parents. Ottawa.
Oh.
So my father was an academic, mother's a teacher. They go to Canada. They have the experience of an Ottawa winter, and they decided that the weather's better in Scotland. We better go back there. So they are an example, a very rare example of going to Scotland because the weather's better. But my sum total of time in Canada, I think I was 9 months old when I left. But I do like to tell people I'm Canadian because I have a Canadian birth certificate. That I've got.
Wonderful. So you mentioned sort of the structure of McKinsey and the global partnership, and I wanted to ask about that. So as someone from the outside in, I see McKinsey as being very efficient, but at the same time, it doesn't have the same like C-suite structure with the CEO and stuff. So how do you sort of go about making decisions? And do you have the final say in a decentralized structure like this?
Well, a partnership is what it says on the tin. We are partners. We together work to take our firm and serve our clients and deliver on our mission of helping our clients achieve distinctive, lasting, and substantial improvements in performance and building a great firm that's able to attract, develop, excite, and retain exceptional people. And we're together as a partnership aiming to do that. But obviously, decisions need to get made. And we have several ways in which that happens. One way is we do have a board of directors. We call it the Shareholders Council, which is an elected group of partners. And I chair that group as the global managing partner. Then we do have leadership for all our different industries or functions or practices, and they're making decisions all the time on behalf of the partnership. So I think the thing about partnership is you entrust partners to make decisions on behalf of the partnership as a whole. And that's the way in which we go about it. It may be a little less efficient than a corporate structure where somebody tells you what to do, but I happen to believe that it's a wonderful structure because it allows you to empower, to mobilize, to be very able to respond to changing circumstance and context. And I believe it also creates a sense of ownership and belonging that is one of the reasons, if not the major reason, why 31 years after I walked into the door of our London office, I'm still here.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that would make sense. I also wanted to ask about the role of mentorship internally within the firm, because I know at the global managing partner level, the role is often transitioned out and there's been multiple. Do you sort of still keep in touch with Dominic Barton and do you guys have dinner and talk about advice and stuff, or how does that go?
Absolutely. A partnership is a place where you make friends for life. So I keep in touch with lots of people. And Dom happens to be rather busy because he's the ambassador to China from Canada. So he's got a lot going on there at the moment. But certainly we talk, and I talked to Ian Davis as well, who was Dom's predecessor. And Ian was the managing partner of our London office when I was worked in one of his teams and got to know him very well. So, there are lots of people I would view as mentors who I stay in touch with and talk to. Many of my people that I worked with early in my career have gone on to do other things I still keep in touch with. It's I think one of the joys of what I do is you make a lot of friends over the years because you're working in a very intense environment on stuff that matters and doing it with a great group of people that you want to stay in touch with, and you do. And so my friends are very much part of the firm. Of course, I got lots of friends who have had nothing whatsoever to do with McKinsey, but I keep in touch with a lot of people and view them as sponsors.
Very fair.
To this day.
Yeah. I also wanted to dive into sort of McKinsey's offices and how they enter new markets. So McKinsey has a lot of offices in many different cities around the world. And I wanted to ask, when there's a new market or an emerging market, how do you sort of think about where to plant a new office and where to set up a base and send the consultants to? Like, what are the factors that go into expansion there?
Well, we do have a lot of offices. I think we have 127 or so, something in that zone, maybe 130. And they're across 65 countries, and they continue to be a place that is very important as anchoring our presence in a given geography. But a lot of the expansion that happens now is because we're entering new fields. So, for example, our practices in the technology arena, we have enormous numbers of people who are true deep technologists. And those backgrounds have led us to, for example, we just completed an acquisition that we closed on the end of last year for a cloud firm that does consulting in the cloud arena that augments what we're already doing in that space. And so a lot of expansion now looks more like expansion into functional or geographic areas as opposed to purely geographic. And you'll find, and we have found, that we continue to grow our practice into areas where we can do what we've done in the core strategy and organization practices that form the bedrock of McKinsey, which is we're always looking for the very best people in their field. We give them the freedom to create new ideas and deliver those ideas to our clients, and we support them and back them with our resources. And that's what we do. That's the way we expand. From a geographic point of view, we will continue to open new offices. I mean, I still have a dream in my head that one day there'll be an office in Scotland. There isn't to this day. We don't have that. And so I've no doubt there will continue to be geographic expansion. And the way we think about it is, does it allow us to do one of two things? Either serve our clients better, which is the first part of our mission, because we're there, we're with them, we're in the business environment, part of the community, or does it allow us to really reach out to a new group of wonderful people that we'd love to see within our firm? So some of our more recent locations, like Denver, ended up being both. Denver, it turned out, was a fantastic place that a lot of people want to live. And at the same time, there is a vibrant business community there that's growing. So that's the kind of logic that leads us to continue to expand locations. Of course, there are also countries where we'll enter in, but there tend to be fewer of those because we're in a lot of countries already.
Yeah, no, that would make sense. And I understand the demand side factors too from talent as well. And what I wanted to ask was, if in the Harvard community and in the Harvard circles, and I'm sure you know of this, that one of the questions that people have about McKinsey is that its talent acquisition pipeline, in the sense that McKinsey and other consulting firms tend to get a disproportionate amount of the top talent from top schools when they graduate, and that potentially has second order consequences to social sector jobs or different things like that. And I wanted to ask sort of how you think about and share that view on the talent pool and talent acquisition at McKinsey.
Well, I think we are part of a bigger talent picture. And if you look at McKinsey, one of the things that is obviously true, and I think people are aware of, is a lot of people join us, build a set of capabilities and skills that they then take to many, many other arenas. And I have no issue with that whatsoever. You know, I certainly joined McKinsey thinking I'd be there for a couple of years. I didn't know what I was getting into. As you heard, that was more by accident than by design. But I also had a strong sense that, maybe I'll try something else. In my case, that's not what transpired, but in the vast majority of people, they don't stay at McKinsey forever. In fact, roughly 1 in 5 people become a partner and go on from there. And as a result, I think one of the reasons why we're so proud of our alumni is they get to do amazing things. And we have alumni in all walks of life. We have alumni who've made a massive contribution to the social sector because in fact, before I came on this, I was talking about one country's vaccine program that's being led by one of our alums, and actually it's one of the ones that's going very well. And at the same time, we've got people who lead many philanthropic and other organizations. And let's be clear, we've got an awful lot of people who've gone on to lead large corporates. So I view us as part of a bigger picture. I think how people choose to begin their careers, I began mine at McKinsey, I'm still here, but I can say to you, I think it's a place where you can learn and build a set of skills that are invaluable in many different sectors. And I think that's important. I think the notion that everyone is ready day one to leave university, go change the world, is one that I endorse and I believe is possibly true. But I also think taking a few years to try something, build some skills, and yes, some people will stay, and obviously I'd like more to stay, is not an equation that we should be worried about. I think it's actually a way in which we can ensure there are just different skills and sets that are needed to solve some of the world's problems. And so I'm aware of the issue. The other observation I just make is we are a very different firm in terms of the range of backgrounds that people now bring. When I joined, people really in the UK, for example, went to Oxford, Cambridge, and the University of London. I was the only one who'd been at the University of Glasgow. I was the only one with a Scottish university by way of background. I mean, it was just a very different context. And so that today, if you join on, you will see we have architects, we have people who are the leading thinkers in design and doers in design. We own a lot of design agencies, people with medical backgrounds. It's a very different mix of profiles. And therefore, we're drawing on a lot of different sources, and people are coming, developing, building expertise. Many are staying, some leave.
Yeah, no, that's very fair. And I think that's very reassuring as someone who's incoming to the SF office. It's nice to know that that relationship is still there. I wanted to ask about globalization and inequality and sort of your perspective on it. One of the big social concerns going on right now is that the world is becoming increasingly unequal. But when you look at the data, it's not clear that that's true between countries, but that is certainly true within countries. And so from a high level, from your take within the firm, how do you sort of think about inequality, both on a domestic level and a global level? And is that something that, how should we work on it?
Well, the short answer is yes, there is a real issue. And the issue is, as you say, inequality between countries has largely been on a reducing path. Let's be clear, that's essentially because India and China, which account for a huge share of the world's population, have been rapidly raising their gross national product or gross domestic product, you can pick your measure, and as a result have closed the income gap that existed. Not completely eliminated, but closed it. But within countries, we're seeing a much bigger spread. I mean, one of the most shocking statistics I recall from a McKinsey Global Institute report a few years ago was the heading was poorer than their parents, poorer than their parents. And the work was looking at the OECD countries. And it essentially said that if you look at data back in the sort of period between about 2000 and between the 90s and the early 2000s, the vast majority of households saw their income levels go up. But if you looked at the period from 2005 to 2015, as opposed to 93 to 2005, but between 2005 and 15, 98% of households saw their income stagnate or go down. And that's in major OECD countries. That's obviously a recipe for a problem. And we're seeing that problem in many different forms around the world. And so one of the phrases that Dan Schulman, who's the CEO of PayPal, has used, which I think captures the sentiment well, is that capitalism needs a reboot or an upgrade. It needs an upgrade. I grew up in Glasgow when, to be clear, there were lots of experiments going on, which were socialist in nature and trying to make the city work. It didn't work out so well. So I still to this day believe that capitalism is indeed probably the least bad form of government, except all those others we've tried, you know, to paraphrase Winston Churchill's comments on democracy. But I think it's true. We need to find a way to address this issue. I don't think it's just globalization. I think globalization has been a factor, but I think part of it is how we think about taxation, how we think about job creation, how we think about geographic issues in terms of labor mobility. There's a lot that goes into this, how we think about reskilling. And so it does require a combination of the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector to fix the situation in which we find ourselves. And I think that is a tough set of levers to pull, but it's very important they work together. And I think we're seeing signs of that happening, whether it's the New York Partnership for Jobs or in DC, some of the organizations I've personally been involved in. There are a lot of people trying to make this happen, but it's going to require a collective effort if we're going to be successful.
Right. And this collective effort bit is interesting because in one of the insights that you and a colleague published called The Next Normal Arrives, where you were forecasting trends, one of the trends that you projected is that actually there would be a spur of entrepreneurship and far more small businesses over the next few years. And I thought that was particularly counterintuitive because after the most recent recession in 2008, 2009, that wasn't the case. But when you look at the data now for new businesses filing for incorporation, that's increased in the US. And so I sort of wanted to ask, why do you think that's the case if people are cash strapped, that they're willing to start new businesses and create this culture of growth?
Well, it's not just the US, the UK, France, Germany have all seen similar rapid increases in the number of new business registrations. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One is the context in which this is happening. So the 2009 recession, the global financial crisis, was a global financial crisis. It was a crisis that had its heart in the challenges of the banking system. If you look at the challenge we're facing now, it's a healthcare initiated crisis that's become an economic crisis. The twin challenge of saving lives and safeguarding livelihoods. So they have a different context. That's part of it. in many respects, the other reason is there's an awful lot of liquidity, money out there in the marketplace, partly because of government action, but partly also because, again, the nature of this crisis wasn't engendered by financial shock, it was engendered by a healthcare shock.
Right.
And I think the other reality is people are seeing that the best way for them to actually create an opportunity maybe to start something. So I think it's a mix of the context, the nature of the crisis, the amount of liquidity that's available to actually get businesses moving, and the sense of, well, I should do it myself because we're in this moment when I'm going to be waiting a long time if I think somebody else is going to help me. I think you've got all those factors coming together and it's created this wave of entrepreneurship. It's also a wave of innovation. There's been enormous innovation in the last 10 months, 12 months, whatever it really is, depending on how you think about the start of the pandemic. Enormous amounts of innovation. And we're seeing that in the healthcare space, most obviously with the vaccines, of course, but we're also seeing it in many other spaces. An example, I was meeting with a manufacturer who was telling me that one of the biggest growth areas they have is automatic door openers. And I was thinking, automatic door openers, that's a high innovation space. I said, yes, of course, because people don't want to touch a door. They want to wave and have the door open. That actually has some technology that you can actually use. How do you do that when you've got lots of people, few people, and buildings that are high rise, low rise? A lot of technology actually in that observation has been brought to bear, and that's an area of great innovation at the moment. So we're seeing enormous amounts of innovation that are occurring, and I think that's also going to be a feature of what comes after this pandemic does end.
And you mentioned the pandemic, and I wanted to sort of ask one final question about that before we jump into the Q&A. McKinsey as a firm depends a lot on the people and their interactions both within the firm and also with the clients. And now that things have been work from home, I sort of wanted to get your reflection on how that's been internally within the firm and sort of working in a decentralized way. And then B, do you think there's any aspects of that might stay permanently for McKinsey long-term?
Well, I think the world is going to see a lot of things change and change for good. How we think about the way we all use our time, how we think about distance. For example, there was a lot of literature being written about the death of distance in the sort of 2000s. And the death of distance was because of this technology. And in one respect, you could say that the pandemic has accelerated the death of distance, because I'm talking to you from New York and there are people probably joining us from wherever, and we're all able to do so seamlessly and the technology is reliable. At the same time, our ability to cross borders is now being challenged in a way that it hasn't been challenged. There are borders between Germany and Austria, between the UK and France that just didn't exist before, or not since the war, or not since the European Union. And think about it, when I came back into New York from Florida last weekend, I then had to be subject to a quarantine, which I tested out of yesterday. That is such a shock to the way in which we were all living our lives, that the notion that somehow or other we're all going to flick back to where we were automatically as soon as, quote, we've all been vaccinated, I think it's just not going to happen. Right. We are going to see, and we certainly expect to see, a reduction in the travel we do. Incidentally, we were already working to reduce that because of our environmental commitments, because we are trying to get our mileage down, because we've made commitments around how we will make sure that we are part of the generation that contributes to meeting the Paris Climate Accords, not getting in the way of doing so. And in that notion, I think we are going to embrace technology a lot more. But I also recognize one of the biggest challenges is social fabric. People do want to be together. They do want to have a chance to spend time. And so we're trying to get that balance right. We will reduce the amount of travel, but we will also find ways to get together. And I think that's going to be a feature of how we and others work in this next normal when it finally gets here.
Well, as someone who's incoming this summer, I'd love that social fabric bit to be true and spend some time with the people in the firm. But I'll transition it over to the Q&A to sort of give the audience a chance to ask questions. So Devanshi, who's from India, asks, hi, Kevin, what are the key leadership skills that you always try to follow to handle different people and different situations when it's dynamic?
I mean, so leadership, it takes many different forms in different contexts. In the McKinsey context, we talk a lot about servant leadership, that I am here to serve the partners, to serve our colleagues, and to make them successful. And I've always had that as the way I think about the challenge of leading. But one CEO said to me, every week we bring CEOs to come and talk to our partner group and other groups. And one CEO, who was the CEO of one of the world's largest tech companies, he and I were discussing on one of these conversations what leadership looked like in the middle of a pandemic. And as we were talking about it, all the usual stuff, you've got to have a vision, you've got to think strategy, you've got to be able to deal with the here and now as well as gaze into the future, all of that. And then he said the last thing that's really important for leaders, you've got to be able to show some love. Show some love. It's not a phrase you often associate with, CEOs. But when you're in a pandemic, empathy, love, understanding, that sort of becomes much more important, because these are tough times. Be in no doubt, we can do what we do. And McKinsey has, we've been very fortunate to find that there's an increasing demand for what we do, and that this has been a period of real growth for our firm. But it's against a backdrop of a really tough time for the world. And it's been really hard. It's been hard for lots of people. I haven't seen my parents for 5 months because they're in lockdown in Glasgow. And in that time, empathy, love, and understanding are probably just as important as the traditional leaderships of vision, ability to cope with pressure, all the things I could trot out. So somewhere between love and servant leadership, I think, lies the answer to that question.
Very fair. The next question I have is about gender equality and issues around that. So a student at Harvard, a junior, Jane Lee, asks, in 2018, you tweeted that you wanted 51% of your staff to be female at the firm. What was the main reason behind this, and how do you sort of incorporate that into your leadership?
Well, there are a number of reasons behind it. One, my two daughters, I think I want them to have all the opportunities I was able to have, and I worry that that's still not the case in many parts of the world and in many places, and I certainly don't want McKinsey to be on the wrong side of that. Secondly, I believe that we have shown that there are lots of reasons to believe you solve problems better if you have views that come from different vantage points, whether it's gender, sexual orientation. I could pick any different angle, but I believe that diverse teams are better teams. And if we aren't diverse, then how can we possibly claim to solve the world's toughest problems? And lastly, but by no means least, just personal experience. My wife was at McKinsey, and I saw her facing obstacles, not necessarily within McKinsey, but with her clients that I never faced. Clients who just assumed that somehow or other, she's standing next to me, I must be the consultant, she must be somebody else. We met at HBS. She has an MBA. And I will never forget that, when we met, she told me she didn't come to Harvard Business School to meet me. She came to have a career. That hasn't been, I don't know if she's here, she's wandering around somewhere. But anyway, that being that's always been in my head. And so I want to make absolutely sure that we are that firm. And until we get to 51%, we're not gender balanced. I can tell you we're actually getting there in terms of our entry classes are very much there, but we've got work to do at the senior levels.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I just saw her walk by and say hi. So hello to her. Wonderful. So the next question comes from Zeel Patel, who's also a junior at Harvard. And she asks, do you have any particular horror stories from when you were a consultant in your early days of your career, say when you were an EM or in the first 2 years, of a client that just did not get along? And how did you collaborate with them? Interesting.
I was blessed by having a wonderful set of clients, but I can remember I was working on a telecoms engagement. There was a small period in my life when most of my career has been serving consumer goods companies. That's what I do, retailers primarily. And there was a short window when I thought, that's too easy because it doesn't feel very complicated. I should go and serve telecoms companies because that's really tough. You've got to understand the engineering and all that. So I had this short window when I was doing that. And I'll never forget, there was one Friday morning when I had been working on a document for this client and we'd sent it off, and the client called and said, this is just terrible. It's just, ridiculous. And I remember the partner said to me, said, look, there's no problem with that happening. It's not the fact they disagree. It's just, what do we do about it? And that was a very valuable lesson, because what we did is we actually listened to them, but then we actually respectfully disagreed because we felt we were right and they were wrong. And our job was to tell them why we felt the way we did. So have there been times when I've disagreed with clients? You bet. And when they've disagreed with me, but I haven't yet. I haven't had clients who've really been, jerks about it. I think it's usually been a conversation where we just see things differently. And I've got many more examples of clients who've just been incredibly good. I'll give you another example where I was working for one of the world's leading healthcare companies, and it was about their retail strategy. And we fundamentally disagreed. And I can remember flying down to meet with this client, sitting there with them. And he was so frustrated. He said, I'm leaving. I'm not going to hear this. I've told you guys off. And I said, listen, I'd like you to sit down, listen to us, because we hear you, we understand, we just disagree, but you need to hear it. And he sat there and then stormed out after he'd heard it.
Oh.
2 days later, and he left, and I thought, oh, well, I'm going to get fired. I called the partner. I was a junior guy at the time. Called the partner, and he said, oh, I know you've done great work. It'll be okay. He's already called me to complain. A week later, I get a phone call from the partner who says, you know, the client called. They're actually wondering if you'd be willing to come back and meet with them. I said, okay. And they've sent their plane. Can you be at the airport in the next hour? I was like, what? Myself and the other colleagues being there, we get on the plane, we fly down, and the client begins the meeting with saying, I want to apologize. I was wrong. I may still disagree with you, but the way I reacted, I was wrong. And you did the right thing, and I'm always going to remember that. That client's one of my closest friends. We've kept in touch. And these things happen. It's just, you know, we're working on important stuff and people disagree.
Right. Wow, that's a very inspiring story. Thank you for sharing that. Aditi from India also asked, and I'm sure you feel this too, you've been in McKinsey for 31 years, which is a very long time according to her. And she says, and she says, do you have any thoughts about what you might potentially do after your time as the global managing partner? And if there's any particular spaces you're interested in working on?
Well, what's interesting about our firm is that will come sooner than not, because actually the reality is everybody leaves. You know, I feel McKinsey is a place where everyone should recognize that, you know, you've played your part. It's important to keep the leadership fresh, and that's the way it works. So it will happen sooner rather than later to me. Have I given much thought to what I want to do? No. Other than a few things, I would like to get involved in public life and make a difference. And that doesn't mean politics. That means help with philanthropies or other organizations, many of which I'm already involved in. And I'd like to find a way to be useful, to do something that I think helps contribute to those organizations that I think have an important role to play in addressing issues like inequality that we were talking about earlier. But more specific than that, no. This is such an intense job in such an intense moment. It has lots of challenges, some big, some less big, but there's always something to keep me on my toes. So I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about what I'll do next, because I'm doing this.
Yeah, you certainly have time. The next question, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this. It's from Yoel Hawa, who's a junior at Harvard. And he asked, during the past summer, there was a recent article that came out in the news about McKinsey and its engagement with government clients. And in particular, it said during the COVID pandemic, McKinsey was able to be involved in a lot of engagements with government clients. And there were mixed reviews about, from the client's perspective, about the value add. And sort of, I'd love to hear your take on that and how you would respond.
Well, we don't really get into arguing about the work we did and we didn't do. Yeah. I think my view of this COVID moment is it's very important to be able to bring skills and capabilities where they're needed. And we happen to have a lot of skills ranging from understanding of healthcare to ability to make change happen, dealing with logistics and other challenges. I think those skills are particularly important. And I can't get into any one situation because it's hard to talk in the abstract, but I think in the body of what we did, I think there's an awful lot to be proud of. And I think about the places we've been involved and the impact we've had. And I think it's made a difference in a very positive time when the world needed people to dig in and make a difference. And we chose to do that. And we were quite thoughtful about some things we wouldn't do and we would do. But I look back in that period of time and a lot of people had to make decisions in the heat of the moment. And of course, with hindsight, people are going to have views as to what worked and didn't work.
Right.
But I'd rather we were involved in making a difference than not. And I think we have skills that are very relevant and still very relevant to the challenges the world faces.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think during the time of crisis, it was particularly important. So thank you. The next question I wanted to ask was from Tanya Singh. She says, what do you think of the future of office spaces? What will they look like and how will they work?
No, I ask that question a lot because we have a lot of office space. So you're absolutely right. It's a big topic. And as always, or maybe as always is going too far, but I think people point to the extremes. We're not going to go 100% remote and we're not going to go 100% back to all being in offices. There's going to be a balance. And I think we've got a renewed appreciation of the value of community and social fabric and being together in person, but also a recognition that we don't need to do that all the time. So my own sense is actually offices will still have a role to play, an important role, but they might look different. I think they're going to have they'll have roles to be a hub for collaboration. They'll also be places that people want to go to just be able to get their work done. I mean, one of the realities of this pandemic is there's a fine line between remote working and sleeping at the office. In other words, I've joined an awful lot of video conferences where I can see the bed in the background, the sleeping bag on the floor. You know, that ain't great either. So offices have a role to play. A lot of people have had to go back home and live with their folks, some of whom think that's terrific, but some of whom actually don't for lots of reasons. So I think we need to have a more balanced conversation. People are going to go back to offices. It's just they're going to be much more realistic about the amount of time. I think FaceTime as a notion will drop. People won't just go back for the hell of showing their face. I think there's going to be a lot more realism around that. And never forget this, that this debate around office space is only relevant to somewhere around 30% of jobs, if even that, probably closer to 20%. The vast majority of people do not have a choice about where they do their work. They need to go somewhere to do it, whether it's a manufacturing line or a retail store or a hotel. And if you think about it that way, it's a sort of luxurious problem to spend all this time agonizing over when it's actually the small minority of people who are really concerned with the issue. But for that matter, we are, because we have a lot of office space, and we're going to continue to have a lot of office space.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The next question I wanted to ask comes from Eric Lin, who is also a junior at Harvard. And he asked about the future of Asia. Before you were the global managing partner, you were the chairman of the Asia offices. And he wanted to know, if you had to pick any one country in Asia in particular that you think will have the same explosive growth like what Korea or China did in the next 50 years, what would you pick and why?
Well, you can come at that from a number of different vantage points. Parag Khanna, who writes very interestingly about the future of Asia, had a great phrase. He said, the US-China trade war continues and we know who the winner is, Vietnam, which I thought was really interesting because there's some truth to that, right? The displacement of work and so on. If you look at it from demography, you have to look to Indonesia, and you have to say, given the size of the population and the fact that, you know, technology and infrastructure will make a big difference to a nation that is a series of archipelagos, so geographically it's challenged, but you can join it up through technology. And it's got the demography, you know, the hundreds of millions of people, I think it's 350 million or whatever the population is today in Indonesia. You'd have to get excited about Indonesia. I am, having spent some time going down there and seeing what's going on because of the scale. Because really, after China and after India, which of course are the two drivers in many respects of global growth, I think you look to Indonesia and say that's the one that in 50 years may actually have made the transition to being a real contributor. It's certainly fundamental to ASEAN, Southeast Asia. And I believe it's certainly fundamental to broader regional growth. So I would pick Indonesia, recognizing China and India still have a long way to go in terms of their growth over the next 50 years.
Yeah, no, perfectly fair. The next question I wanted to ask comes from Jessica, who's also a junior at Harvard. She said, in another life, if you had not chosen to be a consultant, but would work to found a company right now, what industry in particular in Asia would you be most excited to work in?
Healthcare. You know, I think the healthcare situation in Asia is not great. For a variety of reasons, some structural, some to do with availability of medication, some to do with provision of the providers, the actual hospital networks and so on. I think that the Asian healthcare environment, especially given all that we've been through, will be one where there's going to be lots of need and, dare I say it, lots of opportunity to make a difference. Healthcare.
Right. And it's sort of a follow-up to that for me. In the US, as you know, healthcare is very fragmented, especially the data sharing aspects of it. Are those same trends true in Asia? And do you think there's opportunity there?
Yes, but remember, it's very different. The US model is somewhat unique,
right,
with its tilt towards the private sector and the way in which provision occurs and the role of the insurance and so on. So the American healthcare, when I say American, the United States healthcare experience is different than the rest of the world. I make no comment on that other than to say I wouldn't extrapolate from the US to Asia. I think Asia is going to have a very different setup and already does.
Right. Okay. That perfectly fair. And the last thing we sort of wanted to draw from the Q&A is with AI and automation being the future of the work, people are concerned about job losses and opportunities in Asia. Do you think that'll be a particular issue, especially with the high population that's on low-skilled labor in Asia?
Not over the long haul, but in the near term, yes. You know, I think every technology revolution has brought with it more jobs, not less jobs.
Right.
And I think that will be true of this technology-driven revolution that's occurring as we talk. But I think the dislocation is severe, and the time it takes to create those jobs has got challenged by the pandemic. The pandemic in Asia and beyond has accelerated the digital revolution, the extent to which processes and businesses have digitized, the extent to which manufacturing is now also being really overtaken by technology. And a lot of the ways in which I thought the people who were displaced because those low-skilled jobs would be shifted, I thought they'd move into hospitality and some of the other areas. Well, because of the pandemic, those jobs are also challenged. So I do worry that we face a real near-term shock. That means the transition to this world of greater use of technology is going to be a real source of concern. Asia faces the other challenge that, for good reason, people are also now talking about how do we nearshore or reshore jobs and work. Partly because supply chains got very stretched and people are worried about having stretched supply chains. We have to remind ourselves that if that happens and some of the jobs in places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, parts of Asia which rely on manufacturing for the world at a relatively low skill level, that could create enormous poverty. So on the one hand, we talk about poverty, on the other hand, we talk about actions that may create worse poverty in some places that already still have real issues in that regard. So we've got to take a more global look and realize that some of this debate has real implications for those who are least able to withstand some of the challenges that will come if there is indeed a massive reshoring or shift away from some of the traditional sources of supply and manufacturing in Asia for low-cost goods. But all that said and done, no, I'm a believer that over time, technology creates more jobs, not less.
Right. And that seems to be a very multifaceted issue with policymakers involved and private sector involved, et cetera. Before we wrap this up, since I do want to be mindful of your time, I did want to ask one final question. To all the Harvard undergrads that are in attendance and students from all around the world who are graduating into this pandemic and into the economic situation globally right now, what advice would you share with them for how they should approach it and sort of think about the next 2 to 3 years?
And my daughter's a junior at Brown, so she's living this experience too. You know, my older daughter, I would say a few things. First of all, remember this is a period of unprecedented change, challenge, and all that we're experiencing. In that moment, enormous opportunities to learn exist. And we're seeing that with the innovation, to experiment, to learn, to try things. I would urge you to make the most of the fact that, thank goodness, this is occurring at a time when we do have access to technology tools like the one you and I are talking through, Zeel. And therefore use this moment to learn and to really build your capabilities, not see it as a place where you can't. I know there's a huge dialogue going on about how online learning effective it is or is not. But I do think there's access in a way to more people, more information, more insight than would traditionally have been the case. Make the most of that. The second is remember that you are always going to find that the reason that when I meet somebody, I look to hire them for what they're great at, not what they think, not what they're not good at or what they don't know about. We are, like others, so excited to meet people who've taken initiative, who've found ways to help others, who've shown leadership. Do that. Use this moment to do all of the above. Find ways to dig deep and do that. And I know it's not easy when the world around you isn't feeling great. And the last point, and I say this more by way of encouragement, there's a phrase I was always taught, which I really believe, which is it's always darkest before the dawn. It's pretty dark at the moment. I get that. It's winter. New York is pretty grey, and in Scotland we have this word dreich. It doesn't translate, but dank, wet, not looking like a great. It's not a great Friday. I have no idea what it's looking like in Cambridge or in Boston rather, but we'll see. And you're in Calgary, I think you told me, so I don't know what it's like there. But in this winter, in these winter months with lockdowns and all the stuff we're all going through, it doesn't feel great. But we're on the other side of the curve. We're actually closer to the end than to the beginning. Mm-hmm. If you want to read one article on McKinsey.com, go and read When Will This Pandemic End, where we start to talk about the end of the pandemic. I say all that because better days are ahead. And I think that we need to remind ourselves that we will look back on these days. You will look back on these days. And if I can close with a story, maybe I'll just give you a story, Zeel. My daughter graduated from high school this year. So not great years. My younger daughter, not a great year to be a senior, but she was a senior. And we were living at the time in Hong Kong. We've now moved back to the US, but we were living in Hong Kong. And therefore, the graduation ceremony actually was in person, socially distanced, masks, the whole thing, but it took place in person. So she went up to get her diploma, and I got ready to take a nap after she got up. We did the clap, lots of cheering, all that good stuff, because the head teacher, who was rather elderly, got up to speak. And I thought, this is the time to catch up on some sleep. This will be good. So anyway, the head teacher stands up, but she had an interesting opening line. She said, "You are the graduating class of 2020. And I'm from the graduating class of 1968.
Wow.
And she said, 1968 is commonly regarded by many as the worst year after the end of the Second World War. But she says, I think 2020 may beat it to that title. And she said, and here's what I want you to think about. And I thought, okay, well, this is going to be interesting. So I actually decided to wake up and listen. And she said, in 1968, Martin Luther King was murdered. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. The Vietnam War was in full bloody swing. We had riots in the streets of Paris. The Prague Spring in communists crushed some of the fledgling democracies that were taking place in Eastern Europe. It was just a terrible time for the world, terrible time for the world. That was her graduating experience. But she said then 1969 arrived. And in 1969, it was a bit different. In 1969, the Beatles released Abbey Road, which is the iconic album where you see John, Paul, Ringo, they're walking across, George, walking across the zebra crossing outside the Abbey Road studios in London. Woodstock took place. If there are any hippies there, Woodstock took place. Concorde flew for the first time, the Anglo-French supersonic aircraft. The Jumbo Jet flew for the first time. There was progress in civil rights after years of inertia. And to cap it all off, 1969 was the year that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And so she said, so my message to you, the class of 2020, is what are you doing now to make sure that 2021 is to 2020 what 1969 was to 1968? And I think it's worth thinking about that to all of you who are in the class of 2020. What are you doing? And how are you thinking about 2021 and 2022? Because it is just possible, not only that better times are ahead, that this period of remarkable challenge will lead to the innovation, lead to opportunity that you can participate in. And so I'd use the time wisely, because I do believe that 2021, at least the latter part of it, may have more in common with 1969 than with 1968.
Wow, thank you. So the lesson that I'm drawing from this is that after these dark periods, there's incredible progress that we tend to do as a society, and that you're optimistic about that, and so should we all be. And I certainly am. So thank you for sharing that story. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to come speak with us. We really appreciate it. I know you're dialing in early in the morning as well, but for all the students that were around the world, if we could give a virtual round of applause to Kevin from wherever you are. Kevin, thank you so much.
Thank you, and my best wishes to all of you. Stay well.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Zeel. Bye-bye.